You can find the official description of what it takes to get hired as an analyst on the agency's website at www.cia.gov. Please rely on the information there as the only official and guaranteed accurate source. What I'm going to give you here is my impression of what it takes to get hired, based on my experience running analytic hiring programs, interviewing dozens of applicants, and plowing through thousands of applications. I'm also going to try and answer the questions I most commonly receive about how to get hired. Now, if you want to get hired, there are several boxes you need to check. The first one is absolutely non-negotiable, and that is you must be a U.S. citizen. There are no exceptions to this rule because of the security clearance requirements, though naturalized citizens are fine and dual citizens are okay in some cases. Assuming you clear that hurdle, the next thing you need to have, not surprisingly, is excellent grades. You don't have to be at the very top of your class, but you can't be at the bottom. The agency requires a minimum GPA of 3.0 on a 4-point scale, but most people I hired had much higher averages than that. One special note on grades. If you didn't do well as an undergrad but excelled in grad school and have an explanation why, don't be dissuaded from applying because the agency tries to look at the whole person, not just the grades. I occasionally hired applicants with undergrad GPAs under 3.0 who had great grad school grades. In some cases, they switched from pre-med to international relations during their senior year after organic chemistry or similar classes had ravaged their GPA. And then they got straight A's in the courses I really cared about. In my favorite explanation for low grades as an undergrad, one guy I hired who had a 4.0 in grad school noted that while he was an undergrad, he was far too busy being a fire jumper, one of those firefighters who parachutes into remote areas to fight forest fires, to focus on his grades. That explanation worked for me, as anyone who is willing to jump out of an airplane into a raging fire can probably handle the stress of being an analyst. He went on to become a stellar analyst. So if there's more to your story than just your grade point average, be sure to include any explanations in your application. The grades I paid the most attention to were those in relevant classes. So if you want to be an economic analyst, for example, you have to demonstrate that you've actually taken some economics courses. If you want to be a political analyst, I expect to see some courses on international relations, comparative government, and maybe some regional studies. It's certainly possible to get hired as a generalist, someone who's really smart but doesn't have a specific area of focus, but it's much better to demonstrate through your coursework and extracurriculars some form of expertise, whether it's analyzing military issues or understanding Chinese culture and politics. Obviously, if I'm looking to hire an analyst to follow China, the person with a China-specific background will have a better chance of being hired than a generalist. The next characteristic I want to see in an applicant should come as no surprise given what I've already said about the critical skills and tasks of an analyst, and that's a track record of strong research, critical thinking, and writing skills. Have you conducted any independent or in-depth research? Have you won any awards for papers you've written? Most importantly, are your papers analytic or just descriptive? Can you create, support, and convey a clear argument? Your transcripts will give me some idea of this, but so will the writing sample you'll need to provide with your initial application package, as well as how you perform on the written test that's part of the application process. More on that later. Another quality that will help you get hired that should come as no surprise is that you have to be a team player. Have some examples where you have worked on teams either in school or the workplace, because in an interview, I would certainly ask you how you work with others. Show you understand the benefits of having a diverse team that tackles problems together. And again, if you hate working in teams, being an agency analyst would endlessly frustrate you, so don't apply. I mentioned earlier that most people tend to stay at the agency once they get there. That certainly is not a requirement for employment, but I always wanted to know that an applicant was at least considering making the agency a career, rather than a short-term job. When I sensed or an applicant flat out told me that their true career interests lay elsewhere and that the agency was nothing more than a resume builder, I was very unlikely to expend the time, effort, and money required to bring them on board. I needed to think that there was a chance I'd get my investment back. The last thing you need to do if you want to get hired is perhaps the hardest, because a lot of what is required here is out of your hands, and that's survive the security clearance process. As I'll talk about in the next lecture, the clearance process really comes into play after you've already been given the conditional job offer, at which point the hiring process leaves the hands of people like me and moves into the black box that is the security apparatus surrounding getting a clearance. I regularly lost many of my recommended hires to that process, as something they had done or said or hadn't said eventually tripped them up. Sometimes I got frustrated what I saw was far too rigid a screening process that I was powerless to influence, even when I was a senior executive. But often my frustration was with applicants who failed to follow critical advice related to the clearance process that I'm now going to share with you. That advice is: avoid the 3 Ds. So what are the 3 Ds? They are what, in my experience, were the most common and completely avoidable reasons why people couldn't make it through the clearance process and had their conditional offers revoked. The first D is for deception. You absolutely must be completely truthful when filling out any agency paperwork or talking to agency personnel. You need to expose any embarrassing, stupid, or illegal things you've done at the outset. If you want to wait until late in the process when you're being polygraphed to finally come clean, that's not going to cut it. You can't tell half-truths at the beginning and then hope to make up for it later with the full story. The second D is for drugs, the use of illegal ones or the misuse of prescription ones. And now I'm going to say something that I want you to listen to very carefully. Do not apply to a position at the agency unless you have gone 1 year without any illegal drug use. And once you apply, don't use again. Now, because so many applicants I dealt with over the years found this very confusing, I'm going to highlight a few key points here about what I mean by 1 year. First, as a reminder, it's 365 days long and 366 days long in a leap year. There is no waiver for your birthday, New Year's Eve, April 20th, or whatever other days might be special to you. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, the agency's rules on drugs are based on federal law, not state law. So if you spend part of the year in places like Colorado, California, or Amsterdam, you're still on the clock, and anything you do that might be legal there will still reset your clock with the agency. Now that we're clear on what a year is, we can return to the 3 Ds, where my last D is a catch-all that stands for dumb stuff. There are so many stupid things I've seen applicants do to fail out of the process that fall into this category. Some of them include downloading large quantities of software illegally, blackout drinking on a regular basis, committing certain crimes, committing domestic abuse, and posting racist or threatening content online. In one of my favorite examples, one person I recommended for hiring admitted during his processing that he was in the middle of committing a felony. Now, clearly he took my advice to heart about not being deceptive and coming clean, so good for him, but he was not rewarded for his candor in this case. So if you are or have recently committed a felony, do yourself and the agency a favor and just don't apply. If you are felony-free and do apply, in the next section I'm going to give you a couple of tips about how to improve your chances of being hired.